This is Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. On the show, you'll hear from innovators in the food space. We'll have disruptive conversations with people from around the globe who are taking the lead on topics like food sustainability, ending world hunger, food security, and so much more. I'm your host, Paul Newnham. In today's episode, I'm joined by Samir Wanmali, WFP Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. Samir has over 20 years of experience across food security, emergency operations, and program design. And since 2024, he has turned his attention to a region that feeds much of the world, yet where hunger and malnutrition persist in ways that are often overlooked. In this conversation, we explore some of the contradictions at the heart of the Asia-Pacific food story. We discover what resilience actually means in practice for communities across the region, how climate shocks are forcing a fundamental rethink of preparedness and prevention, and what success could look like for Asia-Pacific food systems over the next decade if we get the big decisions right. Let's get into it. Well, it's great to have you here, Samir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks for having me on.
So let's dive straight in. I'd love for you to tell us what first drew you into the world of food development and systems change.
Yeah, I think it wasn't one thing. I think it was a sequence of things, and it started with sort of my parents. I was really fortunate to have my parents that were inquisitive, that sort of, with my sister and I, sort of wanted us to be aware of what was going on. So I was born in India, so I grew up in India, and then the family moved to the UK, and then I went to university in the US. So through that process, I think just the sort of interest in going beyond yourself as a small individual, but to say that it is something bigger. And really, so it starts with my parents. It was the opportunities and the very fortunate opportunities that were afforded to me. And then just the real interest in the subject matter, because it is fascinating. And to use a well-worn cliche, when you're young and aspirational and ambitious, you do want to make change. And really, I wanted to have my life and my work be around issues that were important to me, to my family, to the society, and obviously to the world writ large. I know it sounds cheesy, but it is still holds true.
No, it's not cheesy at all. Just a slight divergence. What part of India were you born in?
In Maharashtra, so Nagpur, right in the middle.
My father was born in India, and I went to school in Uti, down in Tamil Nadu. So
you went to Uti?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. A beautiful part of the country.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, there was a point where my father wanted to send me to boarding school, and Cody and Uti were on the cards, and my mother forbade it. She said, no, he's not going. So it's a small world, but I hope you enjoyed it there.
We could have been classmates. Was there a moment that, through either personally or professionally, when you saw food stopping just becoming this thing that we all kind of engage with, to becoming something that's also political, it's economic, it's a moral issue as well? Was there a point where it sort of shifted in for you from that kind of something that you're thinking about at lunchtime, but moved into this space where you started to think about the dimensions of food and the systems that we get our food from and that create the food that we have?
Yeah, so there, I think it crystallized really when I was at university, and when I read, like many others, Poverty and Famines by Amartya Sen. And there it was very much a sort of, oh my God moment, where it was portrayed as, famine. So he was talking about the Great Bengal Famine, and where that was a man-created, a political famine. And I think that was where my exposure, my interest, or in the world of, let's say, development cooperation or humanitarian assistance, I think well before I got into it, it was that moment where it crystallized, for me at least, of where and why food is so important, and why and where it still remains very unequal in terms of people's ability to secure themselves with the right food, the right healthcare, the right education, that these are political issues and you can't escape them.
Those connections, I think once you start to understand and see those connections, it is something that is hard to unsee. And then you start to understand how the world is the way it is. You work in crisis contexts and often quite relentless, particularly if we turn on the news at the moment, there's just a relentlessness of crisis going on. Is there a specific experience that reminds you about why this work matters, that gives you hope, even when you're facing some of the big challenges or some of the hardest days that I'm sure you've seen over your career?
Yeah, I think so. Both, I have two examples. Well, I have many, but two really, really stand out. And one was in 2008 when I was working for the World Food Program in South Darfur in Sudan. There, it was our sort of response was mostly to internally displaced populations, and they had been displaced as a result of violence. They congregated in large IDP camps, in camps like refugee camps. And I remember sort of going, gung ho, you're professional, you want to do the right thing. And I think one of the moments where I realized not that each country has its own context, but each individual has their own story, was in South Darfur. So we would go to the camps, we would speak with displaced populations, we would speak with mothers, we would speak with fathers, we'd speak with their organized groups that were engaging with the humanitarian community. And there it was this sense where this combination where there was a real sense of agency among those displaced populations. It wasn't as if they were helpless. They had ideas, they had clear aspirations. And I think for me, it was this fantastic opportunity to sort of see my work, the work of WFP, as not something that we're giving to somebody, but something that's co-created with others. And just being able to put yourself in the perspective of someone else, to understand I can still want my kids to become doctors even if I'm in a displacement camp. And so it was really important for me to see how dignity and agency matter, especially in the work that we do. And people, while the context may be difficult and complex, people do not give up, and they want to return to a level of normalcy. And I think a second example is I was WFP's emergency coordinator in 2013 during one of the worst typhoons that hit the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan. And there, it was another opportunity to show the work and the work that we do and the work we do with others, how resilient people are. This was the worst typhoon in almost 80 years. It created such havoc and such damage. But you would see that within 2 or 3 weeks, people were getting back on their feet, and we were working with them to get back on their feet, to make sure that after a period of just making sure that everyone had basic food and water and shelter, it was, what's the next step? How do we get people back to their jobs, to schools? And I think both of the examples really, for me, show where to sort of constantly question what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it, and keep people in the focus of your attention.
No, I love as you were talking, I just had this beautiful picture of partnership. It's not a service. It's not something that you're just doing. It's about coming together. And in both examples, it's about coming together and recognizing that this is not a one-way process. This is a two-way.
Exactly.
You're learning as you're helping, jointly solving and creating solutions. And I think that's amazing. Asia Pacific, where we are, is often described as a region of abundance. It produces so much of the world's food. It has huge innovation, incredible innovations, huge economic growth that we've seen over the years as well. And yet we still see hunger and malnutrition persist. How would you explain that contradiction or that misalignment between these two spaces, this abundance, this innovation, economic growth, with yet still hunger and malnutrition persisting in pockets around Asia Pacific?
Yeah, it's something that I think is it's layered and complex. And so on the one hand, as you say, this region has made some incredible advances in reducing poverty and improving education, certainly on the economic growth side. Yet it's still a region, and this is the paradox, the region still has 69 million people acutely food insecure, acutely hungry, meaning they can't figure out where to get the next meal of a given day. Over almost 1.7 billion people in this region can't afford a healthy food diet, meaning they can't afford to go out to a market or supermarket and buy, let's say, a basket of foods that's nutritionally balanced. So you've got some rice, or you've got some meat and eggs, you've got some vegetables. So 1.7 billion can't afford a healthy diet. We have over 50% of the world's stunted children, meaning their height for their age is much shorter than they should be if you compared it to the rest of the world. And of course, we have the situation where acute malnutrition, where almost 42% of the world's acutely malnourished, meaning those that are really at risk of really having complicated factors, are also in this region. And there is the paradox. So I think the paradox can be explained by a couple of things. One is that while on the aggregate, all the metrics and all the numbers are really good, but the ability for those benefits to be equally distributed, to be equally accessible, is not there. And one of the factors is poverty, meaning income is not always, let's say, evenly accessible or available to everyone. That's a reason for jobs. That's a reason because economic growth, while amazing, is still functioning on the idea of a bottom line of profit. I think there's another reason why we have such contradictory numbers, is that health and education, while they are available, they're not available everywhere in a given country. So I come from India. You know India, it's a massive country. But if you take a look at their performance at a national level, and you go down to Tamil Nadu, or you go to Maharashtra, or you go to Uttar Pradesh, it's a very different picture. So I think what there is one, it goes back to the issue that there's policy decisions and political decisions that affect people's opportunities. Some have them, some do not. There is certainly geography matters. If you take a look in the region, the Pacific Islands are quite isolated from the rest, but they themselves are very difficult to get to geographically, but also have a very different set of issues. You've got countries like Afghanistan or Myanmar, where conflicts are driving these needs and driving the inequality. So it really is, for WFP and for the team here and the team in the region, it's better understanding what that country context is. What does it mean? What does food insecurity, inequality, and malnutrition mean in a country like Laos versus a country like Afghanistan? And based on that understanding of that context, it really is to unpack where WFP plays a role. And WFP can play a role in a humanitarian setting, meaning we provide that urgent food assistance and food or cash, a lot of cash in this region. Or it becomes something where we support governments in their school meals programs, where children are given a hot meal every single day. Or we work with ministries of health on nutrition programs. So the country determines the context then determines how WFP works with partners and communities themselves to make sure that we are trying to get at some of those underlying causes while also trying to meet emergency needs where necessary and where required.
You just spoke to such a breadth of countries where, you're talking from the small island states, Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomons, right through to an Afghanistan, or right through to India. The scale and the difference of these countries, the resources, the geography is massive. How does WFP prioritize within this space?
I think we've evolved quite a bit, and I'm glad to say we've evolved where we've gone from a sort of let's say a one size fits all model to a much more contextualized model. So we have 17 country offices in the region, and they do, as you rightly say, they're varied. Our office in India, for example, we are not doing large scale food distributions, nor are we doing large scale cash distributions. What we're doing is we're working with the government at the state level, where these are, millions of people. We're talking about small countries here. Look at two or three areas where we feel some of those structural or underlying causes of malnutrition arise, and we're working with them. So a few examples is really the Indian government and at the federal and the state level have one of the largest public distribution programs. It's a large safety net program. It reaches 800 million people per month. If you think about a country of over 2 billion, 800 million people requiring monthly assistance also shows that inequality. Our role is not to work on the food. Our role is to bring our global expertise on logistics, on supply chain, on procurement, to work with governments so that they can efficiently procure food, that it's safe for consumption, that we work with the government and the private sector, especially the transporters, to make sure that the food intended for those 800 million people is both purchased and delivered closest to where those people are so that you reduce costs. So our role is really taking our operational know-how from emergencies and applying it in a sort of very strong government, strong development context. On the flip side, in Myanmar, we have over 3.5 million people displaced as a result of the conflict. The government systems aren't able to meet all of those needs. So that is where we are providing cash to those displaced populations. They are using the cash to purchase items on local markets. And that also helps that even in a conflict, markets are working. And we want to make sure that we don't have to import food because that is very expensive and doesn't meet. So somebody, if I import food from elsewhere, maybe I don't like it because I don't eat corn, but I eat rice. So, and the reason why we are delivering cash is we are an independent and neutral actor. We want to make sure that we provide this assistance to everyone that needs it, irrespective of what side of the conflict and what side of the war you are. So those examples just show you that it's not a it's a prioritization of what is most appropriate for us to do in a given context, rather than say we have a one size fits all, here's off the shelf, we apply it everywhere. Because if we did that, we would probably fail and we wouldn't be as effective. And the last bit is our funding model is 100% voluntary, means that our donors and partners provide to WFP, and they are providing up to a certain level in a given country based on our country strategy. So we also then have to weigh what we want to do with the resources that we have. And that de facto makes us prioritize. Let's say we wanted to do 4 things, but we actually can only do 2 things with the funding we have. We focus on those 2 things, but we make sure that what we're doing is appropriate for people, their context, and of course, our role in that country and our role as part of a UN system and a humanitarian system.
And so if you were to talk a little bit about some of the drivers of food insecurity and malnutrition in the region, you've talked about poverty, you've talked about conflict. Are there things that we're underestimating or misunderstanding in this?
I don't know if there's any misunderstanding, and neither is it underestimating, because I think it's nothing new. But climate in this region plays a huge role in affecting the amount of food available, the amount of food that can be grown, or the amount of food that's available on markets, and the cost. So it's neither underestimating nor misunderstanding. It really is sort of knowing that for the future and for this region, climate will play a huge role in people's food security and their nutrition security. And it's not that you need that 1 in 100 years event to show you that. It's happening every year in Southeast Asia, for example. For the last 3 years running, there have been above normal monsoon seasons, including in Thailand, where we are. Now, we don't have an operation in Thailand, but Thailand's flooding last year, Laos and Cambodia's flooding last year, really had an impact on the amount of land that could be cultivated for food. So it is annual, let's say, natural disaster shocks, which are driven by climate change. And then it's the 1 in 100 year event is no longer 1 in 100 years, it's once every 3 years. Pakistan is a really good example of that, where since 2020, even before, I think, 2019, annual flooding in Pakistan has affected on average 2 to 3 million people per year. That's a very distinct thing. So climate shocks, localized climate shocks, really have an effect on production. It has effects on energy prices. It has effects on availability of food. And of course, then the cost of that food for consumers to be able to purchase. Economic shocks, and this region is no stranger to them, starting with the financial crises in 2008 and thereon, COVID, and now the spillover effects of the conflict in the Middle East and in Iran has direct economic effects on the region. So India and Pakistan are very dependent on fuel and fertilizer from Qatar and the Emirates. The sufficient quantity of that, even if countries have reserves, will have a knock-on effect on farmers' ability to grow food. We have countries such as the Pacific where they import almost all of their food. They don't grow enough of it. So for them, the cost of importing is going to be higher. We're trying to do studies right now to look at certain countries in the region just to assess the overall impact. And we're looking at more obvious countries like Pakistan and India, but also equally important, the small island states that are entirely dependent. So economic shocks are sort of the second key driver. And then, as you said, conflict is there. What we see going forward as well is going to be the ways in which governments react to this. So outside of the Afghanistans of the world or the Myanmars or even the Rohingya refugees, where these are pure humanitarian situations, the rest is how will governments begin to handle the fallout of the crises. For this region, we're sort of still on the cusp of some of the countries recovering from COVID and the economic losses. We're now into a situation where governments will have to choose how to allocate their budget. So do I have to allocate it for more fuel? And what is the trade-off going to be for, let's say, still investing in health and education and nutrition programs? So I think really there, what we're seeing and where we see our country directors across the region is those really important discussions with governments on what they are going to prioritize, because then we use that to begin to build coalitions and partnerships to make sure that advances in food security or advances in nutrition aren't reversed and they don't roll back.
And as you were talking, I heard a bit more also about, traditionally WFP has been responding to events and activities, but you're also talking now about how do you prepare, how do you prevent, how do you think differently as well when things are becoming so frequent, so severe. How are you doing that with governments and partners as well?
So there's, I think, a couple of ways. One way is really with the partners and the governments is to make better use of technology and early warning systems, specifically for the climate shocks and the natural disasters. And for that, if we know a week in advance that we will have a severe storm and that it will affect a given area. I mean, technology between satellite imagery, local level early data, it is amazing what we have now that we didn't have 20 years ago. So a lot of that is putting that data analysis and scenarios into the hands of decision makers, including in WFP. And then there's a prevention and a response where we are using what the system calls anticipatory action, which is what exactly it sounds like. Before something happens, we provide cash to those that are likely to be affected, for them to make the right choices, for them to leave a particular area, and for them to be able to meet their food needs within a 14 to a 30-day period. So you give them stuff in advance. You let them make decisions. They often always make the right decisions. They evacuate to safety. They invest in assets. They make sure that their valuables are protected. And they also then are able to get their food through markets without doing it. So that's early warning systems and early action, because we've also seen for every dollar that you invest in preparedness, you save between $3 to $4 on response. And that is quite amazing, because the time it takes for us to launch a response, that takes time, that takes money. So really, wherever possible, invest in the prevention and invest in early action. I think then there's a longer term where we work with, especially with relation to how we deal with the climate shocks, but how communities deal with climate shocks. So it really is building community level preparedness, resilience to those climate shocks. So that ranges really, and we're doing that across the region, from the Afghanistans to the Sri Lankas to the Philippines of the world, where we look at a combination of measures where communities can do flood embankments, where they can plant trees to avoid soil erosion, where they can plant grasses that will allow soil fertility. So it hits two things. One is flood embankments and planting trees, or fast growing and slow growing, ultimately help you deal with the annual flooding that may come. But really, planting grasses is to reclaim land that is washed out so it can be used again to produce. We're doing that in Afghanistan. Over 17,000 hectares around Afghanistan have been reclaimed, where communities are now planting, and they're planting wheat, and they're planting cowpeas, and they're planting fruits, and they're planting vegetables, so that they have access to food that we don't have to give them, and they're equipped to handle any natural disaster event, which is mostly flooding in the case of Afghanistan, or drought, and that's localized drought. So that investment in community resilience is also with the aim that we don't have to go back and provide humanitarian assistance, when in fact communities are able to fend for themselves and do it in a sustainable manner. And I think that's that longer term investment that we're looking on building that resilience to climate shocks and to more frequent and annualized natural disasters.
So if we look ahead 10 years from now, what would success look like for the region if we get food systems right for people and planet? Like what do you think we should be paying more attention to in terms of interventions that can change the game, or system approaches? What would you say in 10 years? What would it look like, and what should we be doing to actually get there?
That's a great question. I wish I had the crystal ball.
It's a big one. I'm giving you a big one.
No, I know. Let me try to not fail miserably in the response. So a couple of things. The low-hanging fruit would be, we don't have 17 country offices in this region. That to me is a great indicator of success, that we as WFP with others have sort of done our job. And so we don't need presence everywhere. We may have hopefully fewer offices. So I think that for WFP, it really is goal of being able to elegantly withdraw, but still be there for governments if they want our support. But you don't need 17 country offices to do that. So that's one. I think the second big change that we need to think about and potentially tap into is technology and AI. And I think this is the region where both technology and AI are far ahead of the game within the private sector for transactional types of purposes. But then there's this tension, as we know, about how do we use technology and AI without necessarily endangering future jobs. So you've got this dichotomy where there is a potential huge innovation that could be made by governments to progressively, what we call, digitize their public policy. to make sure they have the right evidence, the right money, they can track it, they're accountable to their populations. And that, to me, is something that can be achieved through technology, but we'll still need humans, and a lot of them, to make sure there's quality control. But there are things that governments can do that saves the money that can then be reinvested in some of the big gap areas. So technology and AI are there. I think on the food system side, it's to think about not individual countries, but sub-regions. Because I think if we're looking at climate, really, it's potentially not to think about Laos and Cambodia, but to think of the Mekong as a delta. So a geographic space, an ecological space, I should say, and an ecosystem because of the interconnectedness of that ecosystem. So rather than thinking about one country and the areas of that country that will produce wheat or sunflowers, we look at an ecosystem, because I think the real challenge is to look at that interconnectedness and thinking about this as a system rather than individual countries. Case in point, everyone grows rice in Asia. It is the staple crop. But methane emissions from rice are some of the highest in the world in this region. So we've got a food issue that's linked to an environmental issue. But again, science, technology, and looking at ecosystems doesn't mean it's either or. It just means that the system is complex and the subregion is complex, and you need to figure out where best a set of collective investments go. I think the third real big area related to that is that middle ground between the farm and the consumer. And that really is that middle food supply chain, the aggregation centers, food processing that could create jobs. It really is a role where the private sector can play a hugely influential and positive role, because it's the one where everyone knows about the consumer. We can talk about how is food affordable or not affordable. Everyone can talk about production, but it's that middle area that, depending on whether you've got the right services and institutions in place, it can make a great harvest mean nothing if there's nothing in between taking the great harvest, processing it, and getting it to people that need it. And then lastly, I really think we've got to keep an eye on conflicts that will arise as a result of resources. And I think that's where, while WFP may see a decrease in the number of country offices, we may see increases in countries that we've never been to. So I think what we're seeing now, obviously most publicly between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or Pakistan and India, while it is a political issue, there are resources involved, water in particular, that are very sensitive flashpoints. And I think we just need to keep an eye on that. But that's, again, this should be a collective responsibility. It cannot be one agency or one voice ringing the bell. It really needs to be something that we look at coalitions to come around. In the same way we have coalitions to come around climate or school feeding, school meals, we need coalitions to think about conflict prevention. And I think in not the traditional sense where you've got warring countries, but conflicts that start low intensity, but then have a real risk of exploding.
And access to water is a key one that we've seen flash in so many parts of the world.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, really, really interesting. What gives you hope right now, given all that's going on in the world? What's giving you hope?
Well, it depends on the day, Paul. I'll be really honest with you. Some days I'm at like rock bottom, where I'm like, oh my God, how do we deal with this one? So I think that one is at least within WFP and with WFP globally, and I think you have probably heard us talk about this. There's collective problem solving. It's not that we're just sort of wallowing in our misery. We may wallow, it may be a day or two, and then we get on with it. Yeah, everyone needs a bit of space, but really it's problem solving. And that problem solving really comes from our country offices and our staff and their day-to-day engagement with people that we support. So that gives me hope. It gives me hope that, yes, there are many things that will be obstacles, and yet we can get around them. I think the second one really is to help, and I think this is something that I try to do, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, is things that are in your control and things that are not in your control. Being able to really accept that some things are simply not under your control, but what you're doing can help influence that, and it's an extension of the problem solving. But the case in point is just keeping our advocacy messages high on the fact that globally we have 318 million people that are acutely food insecure. In Asia, there's 69. A potential 45 additional million people could become acutely food insecure as a result of the Iran conflict globally. So it is making sure that we do everything which is in our control to keep food insecurity, vulnerability highest on the agenda, to make sure that we advocate to stop conflicts, allow humanitarian workers to operate safely without fear of being kidnapped, killed, or detained. So it really is that advocacy. And I think really the hope comes from government, well, at least in this region, it comes from people and governments really leaning forward. I mean, despite differences and despite me or any other WFP staff member in the region wanting governments to do more, 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 I think we also need to acknowledge they are doing a lot, and we need to be able to help them to do that. And we also need to be able to help people who don't have a voice get voice, because they will also hold their governments accountable in the long term. We can't do it always. So, and then last but not least, it's really being able to share these experiences in podcasts like this. That gives me hope that there's interest in this still, in at a time where it's very hard to generate that interest given everything that's going on. I mean, some of my friends refuse to read the news every day because they're like, it's just too much. And I get it. So keeping hope alive, I feel what WFP can continue to use the good things that we're doing to illustrate that there are solutions, we can achieve results, and we have a role. Even when everything sort of seems to indicate we don't, we somehow come through. And that's what continues to sort of drive me and, of course, drive the team.
One recurring question as we come to a close, I like to ask everyone is, what's a food memory that shaped who you are today?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. So again, Darfur, camel meat. So in Darfur, in Sudan, camels are more valuable than children. And I say that both seriously and as a joke, but it is true. A camel as an asset is amazing. The people will protect their entire livelihoods and go into war based on their camel herds. But what was really interesting was that it is really a delicacy. And we would often do field trips from the capital of South Darfur out to camps or to communities. And despite the fact that there was a full-blown conflict and people did not have food themselves, a meal would always be prepared for the team, the WFP team, our local partners. And you knew you were sort of in the good graces once camel meat came out, because it's so scarce and it's so good. So for me, that memory is, and this is the cliche, and I'm sure you've heard it, food remains the most important magnet that brings people together, because you have to interact. And then when food becomes a gesture of solidarity, of being the same, and when people offer you the most expensive food item that they have, it is both moving and also shows you this absolute sense where we have connections around food. And those meals that we would had, and the camel meat, which I only had a little because it sort of made me sick, but not everyone else had it, was that sense of solidarity, of being really in it together, and really friendship and relationship building and trust. And it all comes around food. And I think that's true in every culture, that once you share meals, their trust is built, relationships are built, understanding is built. And I think that's one of many memories, but I think the theme is still really important and still really relevant.
Well, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate this conversation and the work that you and the broader team at WFP are doing around the world. It's so important.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks for everything. It was a really great chat.
You've been listening to Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. Future Fork is produced by Disruptive Consulting Solutions and supports the SDG2 Advocacy Hub. For more info, head to the website futureforkpodcast.com. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Wavelength Creative. So you don't miss an episode of Future Fork, make sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Paul Newnham, and I'll see you in the next episode.